Well, Osita Nwanevu, welcome to the Climate Pod. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, so excited to talk to you. Very much enjoyed the book. And I thought I want to start with, I think, one of the most surprising and interesting areas you take this book into, which is expanding beyond what I would think of traditionally as our ideas of democracy and what our focus areas are in terms of improving democracy. You expand that into something that I think is extremely valuable and extremely relevant, which is this idea of economic democracy. Now, this is the climate pod. I want to talk about it, and I'll talk about it in terms of how this relates, I think, to the climate crisis. But for our listeners, can you define what you think of as an economic democracy that we're missing here in the United States?
Sure thing. So to rewind it all the way backwards, I mean, one of the projects of this book was to really get to the first principles of what democracy actually means. It's a word that we use a lot, we take for granted. I was really, really troubled by features of our political system that we call democratic, wanted to understand whether that was true, and that meant I had to sort of go back to the drawing board and try to figure out what the actual concept meant. And after reading a lot of very dry and dusty books, I came to a pretty succinct definition, which is that a democracy is a system in which the governed govern. The people who are governed by a system are the ones themselves who are doing the governing. It's not a responsibility that's given over to some king, some class of elites, some other set of authorities. The people who are themselves subject to governance to the governing. That seemed intuitive. As I go into in the book, I think there are a lot of reasons why our political system fails to meet that standard. But when you talk about the concept of being governed, one of the provocations that I found really, really interesting as I was doing research for this book was writers and thinkers who got us to think about all the other places we are governed, beyond Washington, D.C., beyond politics. Are there spaces in our lives where we are subject to authority without very much agency? And obviously there are. And I think the most obvious place is, the workplace and the places where we sit within the economy. We spend about a third of our lives at work. The decisions that are made at work often affect us more directly, intimately, and immediately than decisions made in Washington, D.C., or our state houses or our state capitals. But we take for granted that we're not entitled for any democratic agency on that basis. And that's despite the fact that, as people like Elizabeth Anderson, a philosopher who wrote this wonderful book called Private Government, have pointed out, at work we're subject to a lot of functionally authoritarian uh, procedures, measures, controls over how we spend our time, how we behave. As we've seen just in the last week or so with the Charlie Kirk situation, people are being punished outside of their work for things that they say and do. And so these would all be troubling to us on democratic grounds. If we're entitled to self-governance, and we believe in democracy because we're entitled to, or believe we ought to be entitled to, some measure of control over the conditions that shape our lives, obviously the economy is a big part of that. And work is a big part of that. So I spend a lot of time in the book trying to tease through that tension and offer some solutions that would bring us closer to what I call economic democracy, which is a phrase that was in much greater use, I think, at the turn of the century. Was not necessarily even a left-wing phrase. You had people like Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson and other people, at the center of American politics, invoking the idea that we are entitled to some measure of control as ordinary people over the functions of the economy. It's not just something that executives and wealthy people should be left to on their own. So that's what I try to work through in the book.
It's fascinating, and it's fascinating because it's fascinating for this podcast in particular because, as you might imagine, pretty left wing podcasts have a lot of writers and thinkers and people that engage with civil society that are very comfortable in the political and civil society spaces, and for good reason. There's a lot of change you can make in those spaces. The most change you can make with regards to the climate crisis is through government action. And I think that there is, for good reason, more hesitancy from some sections of the climate movement about how to work within private industry. The reason I think that there is some hesitancy there is the kind of very anti-democratic structures in the United States that are allowed. And then when I think about the climate crisis, like the short version that we and so many other people explore on and various media platforms is the idea that the fossil fuel industry has the lion's share of the blame for why we have not met climate action faster. And what I really found interesting with your writing is how you think about ways to go even beyond what we think of as traditional union membership and organizing, and how we get even more economic freedoms within corporate structures. I think that that would be an extremely valuable path for the climate movement to more evaluate and understand and talk about. And I also just don't think it's like an inherently left wing idea. Like, I think there's a lot of crossover between people of different political ideologies that would love to have more economic freedom, more economic democracy in the workplace. So I guess, like, what was it when you think about expanding beyond what we think of as sort of the heyday of union membership? When I think about a third of Americans, you write, were union members, we actually it'd be great if we went beyond that. What might that world look like, Asita?
Well, that's the last chapter of the book, and what I tried to sketch out. And I think the picture I'm trying to create is, when it comes to building worker power, I think the best way to think about it is to think about an integrated infrastructure. So traditional unions are part of that. But in Europe, they have different levels of worker organization, and some of that is built even within the structure of firms. You have co-determination, for instance, where you have work representatives on corporate boards. You have works councils. They're kind of structures that mediate work disputes and working conditions that are built in within the firm on top of traditional unions. You have sectoral bargaining, where um, lots of different firms across an entire industry will bargain with unions all together at once. And so you have these contracts that bind together thousands of workers, all together, rather than this piecemeal approach where you organize one workplace and have to do another, and it's impossible to get industry-wide representation on that scale. So I'm trying to create a sort of a sense that if you want to build economic democracy and build powerful workers, that means organizing and creating institutions at different levels of firm organization, that are really integrated and that meet different needs. So when it comes to climate, I think that even traditional unions and expanding traditional unions, that's still a worthwhile goal. I think that's still very, very important. But we can do more with that structure and with traditional unions than I think we're used to thinking about. I think it would be great to expand the kinds of things that unions can negotiate their contracts over, for instance. So rather than just wages and working conditions, if a union wants to come together and say, look, we want you to make certain climate commitments. We want you to change certain aspects of the way you do business to meet certain climate objectives. I think that ought to be a protected way, a protected set of concerns that you could bring to the bargaining table when it comes to climate change. So within the structure of firms too, if we had co-determination, you had worker representatives on boards mandated by some law, by some statute for companies of a certain size, that's a very easy way to get worker representatives at the table where corporate decisions are made and saying, we want this company to make extra Y commitments. We want them to change this or that process to make it more carbon neutral. That's happening at the executive board level. So there are lots of different ways and things you can do with these kinds of procedures, these kinds of structures. But the status quo where we hope and we expect executives and shareholders to be concerned enough about climate change to do things on their own, and we hope that there are these material incentives that have been put forward by laws, the Inflation Reduction Act, and all the incentives that are based on that. That's not, I don't think, good enough. I don't think that gets us to where we ought to be. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's so important to figure out ways to get workers, and often workers who are going to be directly affected by climate change, at the table where these decisions are made directly, and to make that an integrated part of what people are allowed to do when it comes to labor organizing.
There are many things you argue very well in this book. You make the case for democracy and democracy being great. And you also make the case that we don't have a democracy in the United States. And what I think is very interesting about your take on this is a conversation argument that I can remember going all the way back to civics class in like high school and middle school, which is like the conservatives saying, we don't have a democracy, we have a republic. More liberal folks saying, we have a democracy. That's what the founders intended, and we should have a democracy. And what's fascinating is that while you argue that we should have a democracy, you kind of side here with the conservatives as the founders intended a republic and not a democracy, and really had no interest in democracy. So where does the shortcomings start when we think about the constitutional foundation that has kept us from a
Yeah.
democracy?
Yeah. So, I mean, I side with the conservatives as a matter of historical perspective. This is like a classic is ought question. The fact that we are something does not mean we should be that thing or continue in that path. I think that it is historically true that the founders were very, very hostile to democracy, very, very afraid of democracy, and instead created a republican government. And what republicanism means, as I get into the book, is basically a system of distributed power. So you don't have a king that just lords over everybody. You have checks and balances, you have different levels of government, you have rule of law, these kinds of things, separation of powers, and so on. But that's not intrinsically democratic, as good as those things might be. If you look at the Roman Republic, for instance, which the founders obviously drew upon, it had certain popular features to their government, but there was not a representative democracy in any meaningful sense. The Italian republics of the Middle Ages and Renaissance, these were basically, you know, oligarchies ruled by merchant elites that got to vote amongst themselves, right? But they were not representative democracies that represented, most of the people living there. And that's the kind of what the founders were drawing upon when they created our system. They come to it in 1787 on the heels of an economic crisis that followed the American Revolution. For all kinds of reasons, we enter a depression that's, the worst depression we faced until the Great Depression of the 1930s. And there are two levels of government that basically have to deal with this. You have the federal government with the Articles of Confederation that is truly ineffectual in all the ways I think that people are generally taught in civics class. You can't do anything of real substance without supermajorities. You can't ask the states directly for things. You can ask them to contribute to the federal coffers. They can just say no, and they often do. So it's a really kind of moribund top level federal government. But at the state level, you have actually very, very active state legislatures that are democratically accessible. And so in the middle of this economic crisis, you have poor farmers, people in the backcountry saying, look, we need you to do something to make it easier for us to pay our taxes and to pay off our debts. You can print paper money, for instance. You can let us pay for our taxes and our debts in kind with goods or delay payments and do all kinds of things. And most of the state legislatures actually respond, and they respond in ways that are deeply, deeply troubling to the wealthiest people in the country, of whom the founders were among, obviously. They see these measures as basically undermining the integrity of private property, undermining the stability of contracts. They think that people are shirking their obligations because they're lazy, because they haven't been spending well, and then they haven't been managing their finances responsibly. And so all of this really, really troubles the founders. And what troubles them most of all is an uprising in 1786, 1787, Massachusetts, which is one of the states that resisted some of these relief measures. And it's an uprising. There are a lot of people involved, but it gets associated with one of the men named Daniel Shays, um, and it's put down eventually by a private army. But the fact that it gets that far, and you see other uprisings around the country, really, really troubles the founders. They think that they have an ineffectual governing order in the United States, an ineffective federal government, very, very democratically accessible state governments. And people are using those state governments to make economic policy in populist ways. And so they need something new, they think. And they come to Philadelphia in 1787 with the objective to create a sovereign, a strong federal government that can act above the states, act upon the states without any kind of resistance. They can act directly upon the American people. And that's less democratically accessible. And, this is discussed pretty directly at the convention. First speech that's made is made by Edmund Randolph. And he says that the chief thing that had brought them there was an excess of democracy at the state level. You see this over and over and over again in speeches, which we do have. We have a record of what they said at the convention. We have letters back and forth between the founders. And it's quite clear that when it comes to creation of things like the Senate, the design of the judiciary, the design of the presidency, much of what is happening is that they're trying to create a system that is Republican in nature, sure, but is not democratically Republican. It's distributed power, but not distributed in such a way that empowers directly the American people. And that's, I think, part of what we're still dealing with today. Obviously, the system has improved to a large extent. We have votes for all Americans, even if you're a woman, even if you're a minority. We have direct election of senators and so on. But the basic structural features that they set in place in 1787 are the ones that are still frustrating policymaking today, from my perspective.
We'll get into some of those frustrations, especially on the legislative side. But I think another very interesting argument, something you highlight in the book, is the trust we should have in each other when we vote. I don't think that that it's crazy to look at our current media environment and all the distortion and misinformation and wonder how people will get good information. I don't think it's crazy to look at labor practices in the United States in 2025 and think, well, people just don't have the time to get a lot of great information about policies that are going to dictate their life. And no matter what party wins in an election, of the other party, voters for the other party, look around at the electorate and just think, oh, people are just too stupid to understand the right way that this country, the right direction we should go in this country. I think you write about this in such a compelling and interesting way. What is it that we are often misunderstanding when we think of the our neighbors, other voters, as not being good enough or informed enough to make informed decisions over the right people to elect?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the most important thing is to sort of put yourself in historical context. Like, are we plagued by misinformation today? Yes. Are people getting their information from partisan media? Yes. Do people have a lot of busy things going on in their lives that make it difficult for them to process political information? Yes. I think these things are all definitely true. Were things better in 1925 or 1825 on any of these fronts where people plugged into, responsible mainstream media organizations back in the time when every newspaper was a partisan newspaper, and you'd get your news from like a local guy who doesn't know what they're talking about, who writes, who just has a printing press, or so on, or you're listening to Father Coughlin on the radio. These things have been with us as far as time is concerned. Yeah, we have busy lives, but we used to not have a 5-day work week. People used to, So I think it's important to understand that as bad as things seem now, and they are bad in ways we should take seriously, things have been much worse in America, and people still found it possible to do the work of politics and to pull the country in a better direction. And I think that should be encouraging to us. Now, when it comes to how to solve some of these problems, I talk about how there are different things we can do to improve the information environment. So we invest very, very little in public media in this country. In fact, we're attacking the little public media that we have. In Europe, obviously, they have robust systems of public media that people have studied and found inform people better, get them more engaged. Commonsensically, it does make sense to have forms of media, forms of getting your political information that are not only nonpartisan, but non-commercial. You're not depending upon corporations to do your journalism. So if we invest in that, maybe we'd see some better results. Um, but I don't. In general, I just don't think that there's that much reason for a kind of nihilistic despair, even about the fact that Donald Trump won the popular vote in November. If you take democracy seriously, you take seriously the fact that you are going to lose sometimes. People are going to make mistakes. But the promise of democracy is it's a system in which you act, you see the consequences of your actions, you have debates about it, you see what ought to be changed, and you reset the deck, you try again, and maybe a different outcome occurs. You're not locked into and don't have to sort of uh, be beholden to a particular outcome. It's dynamism. It's this capacity for change, this capacity to learn. It's the only way you can. It's the only system of government that allows you to learn the way that we do as ordinary people. When in our own personal lives, when we make mistakes, when we mess up, we look at that and we say, well, let's do something different. There's no other form of social organization, no other form of making collective decisions, of governing society that has that same kind of capacity to reset the deck and try again that democracy does. And so that should encourage us as well. But I think that so often we talk about politics and we talk about democracy as though the only way this can work is, everybody gets their news from the right kinds of sources. Everybody reads the New York Times and they read CNN or watch CNN, and they realize when they listen to those sources, they're respectable and they talk together civilly with their fellow Americans. You come to understand we actually have more in common than what separates us, and these divisions are all kind of fake, and they're all sort of forced upon us by people who are trying to manipulate us. And some of that is true, but in a society as large and diverse and as free as the United States, we are going to disagree. Politics is going to get contentious. And we have to understand that that's part of what makes democracy work and makes it valuable. We can't always assume that there is some kind of consensus to be found if we sort of, pull back and form a perfect innovation environment, or we all talk together in the right ways. Division is real, and we have reasons to be divided. And the trick is, how do we manage and navigate those divisions without it escalating into or devolving into political violence and illiberalism? That's the question. But I don't see the mere fact that there is partisanship and there is argument and there is disagreement and there's often contentious disagreement is something that should trouble us. It's been worse in the past. Um, and I think that we actually found our way through those times and pulled ourselves towards a better country.
And as you write about, when women did not have the right to vote, or people of
Right.
color did not have the right to vote, and were new entrants into the political process, into the voting process, what did that? What did we end up with? We ended up with a better society for women and people of color, and for the nation overall. And the expectation might be, okay, well, people who are newer to voting aren't going to have as much information. But as you write about, that's not what, like, the fears that
Yeah.
founders may have had.
Yeah.
The exact opposite
Oh,
comes
I
true,
think I
right?
think I think they would have had less information if you are barred from participating in politics, and you have no ability to participate. You're not going to pay attention in the way that somebody who's a privileged white male would have. And so people who are entering the polls for the first time, whether it was women or African American, I think that they would have been less informed on average than the white men who'd been able to participate in politics for many, many years. And if you are one of the cynics about democracy, I think you would have looked at that situation and say, well, the country's going to go to hell if we let this vast, underinformed electorate come into the vote. And I think the exact opposite happened. It was good for them. They eventually became politically engaged, informed, educated, involved. It was good for the entire country as a whole. I don't think the country was worse off for having had that happen. So I think that we have much more of a capacity to make democracy work, um, than we're often given to believe. And I don't think that the fact that people vote poorly sometimes, or we have bad elections, should diminish our faith in the process. In fact, I think that if we present ourselves as being fair weather friends of democracy. We're for it when we win, and we're against it or ambivalent about it when we don't win. That's only going to sort of clear the ground for authoritarians to say, well, look, these people don't actually believe in this system. They believe in their own power. So why even bother with democracy at all if they're not willing to defend it consistently and defend it when they don't get their way? I think it's really, really important for us to maintain a faith in this system and maintain a sense that it can work. As stupidly as people vote and as misinformed as people are, I think that we have a lot of evidence in our own experience that this is a good system and it can do a lot for us, a lot more for us, in fact, than we already know and expect.
You've touched on a few of the characteristics and values of democracy that you define in the book. What are sort of the characteristics of a strong democracy?
So I think that you can tell a system is democratic, and that means again a system in which the governed govern. If it has three basic components, the first one is political equality. Everybody who comes to a collective choice has to be in equal standing. If that's not the case, it may functionally be true that some privileged minority, some privileged class is actually pulling the strings. Everybody has to be in equal standing in a democracy. The second thing is responsiveness. Democratic systems respond to the public. Democracy is not a suggestion box. When people come to make a collective choice, things happen on that basis. And then the third thing is majority rule. Of all of the ways in which we can make a collective choice together, from some form of unanimous agreement all the way to some form of minority rule, Majority rule is the only one that's consistent with the principle of equality. If two people want one thing, three people want some other thing, it's very hard for the two to get their way over the three unless there's some kind of inequality involved. Majority rule is the only one that sort of intuitively means that everybody who's cast a vote has had their vote count equally. They sound commonsensical if you sort of lay them out that way to most people. But our system flouts them, I think, in very, very elemental, basic ways. And so I've, for instance, done a lot of these talks so far in Washington, D.C. And I've made a point of saying every time that we're in a city of about 700,000 people, doesn't have a full and equal say in federal governance. They have a single non-voting delegate, Eleanor Holmes Norton, who cannot cast a vote in the final passage of legislation. Right? So they are being governed by the federal government without actually participating fully and directly in governance. And there are 4 million Americans for whom that's true, most of whom live in Puerto Rico. There is no definition of democracy in which those people are living in one. It's just flat out, they're not participating equally and fully in governance. And of course, even if those of us who do have full political rights are represented very unequally, as I think most people who listen to your podcast probably know. So the United States Senate, because it's equally apportioned, this means that a resident of Wyoming, state of about, I think, fewer than 600,000 people, fewer people than Washington, D.C., as a matter of fact, they have the same number of senators as California, a state of 40 million people. For its own country, it'd be one of the 40 largest countries in the world. It is one of the largest economies in the world. What this means functionally is that somebody who lives in Wyoming has about 67 times representation as somebody who lives in California. We're told in civics class, if we take civics class, that this is balanced out by the House of Representatives, which is the population apportioned house. But that's really not true. The Senate alone shapes the judiciary. The Senate alone shapes the executive branch. You need both houses to pass legislation. So you can have a functional veto in the Senate that bars legislation from being passed. And so that inequity matters, and it matters in ways that actually spread throughout the rest of the federal government. So anyway, the three basic characteristics I laid out, equality, responsiveness, majority rule, I think intuitively, once you accept that democracy is about the governing, they make sense as basic characteristics. But I think in the ways I've just described, and all kinds of ways I talk about in the book, our federal system is well short of meeting them, and short by international standards. I don't think that there's a perfect democracy out there. I think it's gradients. And I think that, measured against some of our peers, especially in Europe, we're doing actually very, very poorly in meeting basic democratic standards.
The two biggest international climate agreements of my lifetime were the Kyoto Protocol in the late 90s and the Paris Agreement of 10 years ago. Kyoto Protocol, there was the Byrd-Hagel resolution, so it was kind of kneecapped in the Senate by including many prominent Democrats like John Kerry and Joe Biden. But was, obviously it was President Bush that officially withdrew the United States from the Kyoto Protocol. Paris Agreement first was withdrawn by President Donald Trump. What we have in 2017 and 2001 is a similarity, which neither of those presidents were elected through the popular vote for those terms, right? They were elected through the Electoral College. And it's just one of the wildest things that still remains in American politics. And if you view it for the climate lens, it's been extraordinarily impactful on the American climate fight because of what we were unable to pass and the ways in which we were unable to participate in the international community. Why do we still have the Electoral College, Osita?
Well, I think we have the Electoral College because the states that benefit from that power don't want us to get rid of it. I think that's as simple as that. The Republican Party, I think, is perceived that it's benefited in the last 25 years, although the advantage in the Electoral College swings back and forth. But look, for as long as I think they've done polling on the question, back I think into the 1940s, Americans have thought that this was a dumb system that they've wanted to get rid of. It's been a subject of conversation for many, many decades. Even people who don't do what I did and read a lot of boring books about political theory intuitively understand that there's something weird about this system. Today, I think it's about 80% of countries with presidents like ours, so that's combined head of state and government, similar functions. 80% of them elect their presidents by popular vote. I think majority of them actually mandate a majority of the popular vote for their election. In not doing so, we're in the company of countries like Micronesia and Botswana. And no disrespect to Micronesia or Botswana, but this is just an indication that most countries don't do things this way. And so I think it's partially a function of entrenched interest in preserving the system. But I also think the other issue is that the Constitution is very, very difficult to amend, which is a problem in and of itself. It's one of the hardest constitutions in the world to amend. And so to put forward a successful amendment on this question, it would take a long time. It would take a lot of consensus that I don't think exists. Now, fortunately, and I don't think most people know this, there is an alternative to the constitutional amendment, and it's this thing called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. What it is this. States can actually decide how their electoral votes are going to be allocated. So states can say, if they'd like to, that we would like our electoral votes to go to the winner of the national popular vote. And if a state's numbering 270 electoral votes that you need to win, do this, and that 270 go to the person who's won the national popular vote, you've functionally eliminated or at least circumvented the electoral college. And there have actually been a number of states holding, I think, about 200 and some electoral votes committed to this process already. It's kind of happened behind the scenes. It's not been a major, push that's very, very prominent. But I think activists have been working on this for the last couple of decades. Mostly liberal states have done this, and so to get that last bunch of votes committed to this process, I think that the states that remain are kind of in the middle politically or kind of to the right. But it is within the realm of possibility that if we really invested in a push here, if more people knew about it, if there was more activism about it, we could see, the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact come into effect in the next 10 to 15 years. And that's a much more plausible route to getting rid of the Electoral College than a constitutional amendment. I am certain that there would be a constitutional challenge. We actually hit 270, but that's something that you could deal with as well, in ways that I talk about in the book when it comes to judiciary reform. But it's nonsensical to continue to elect presidents this way, and I don't know. I think that most Americans have felt this for a long time. I don't need to make the argument. I think most people perceive that this is silly.
One of the things that I love and is not silly is ranked choice voting, which is something I've never actually done because I live in Indiana. We don't have ranked choice voting, but it's interesting that they have it in like Alaska. It's interesting that in more conservative areas they have ranked choice voting. And also, as you write, when people participate in ranked choice voting, get used to it, kind of like it, and it makes things more democratic. How does it actually make voting more democratic?
Sure. So in most elections in America today, you're going to the polls to vote for one guy. So in the House, for instance, you come to the polls every 2 years, you vote for a single candidate, and that candidate doesn't actually have to win a majority of the vote to win. If you win 40% of the vote, and all the other people on the ballot win actually majority of the vote altogether, you still win as the top guy, even though most of the people who voted didn't want you in office. It's very, very strange from a democratic perspective, but that's the way we've gotten used to elections working. What ranked choice voting does is this. It says that instead of going to the polls to vote for one guy, you actually cast a ballot or cast a vote for all the other candidates on the ballot, and you rank them in terms of who you like the best, in rank order. And the votes are tallied in such a way that the person who ends up on top is the person who's won the majority of the vote. So let's say your first choice gets eliminated because they didn't meet a certain threshold. All your other votes could potentially count for your second, third, fourth favorite candidates. And so your preference gets processed through all the other candidates, and the person who wins is the one who's gotten a true majority of support. That's it in a nutshell. There are a lot of different reasons why this is beneficial beyond the fact that it's a system of guaranteeing that the person who wins actually wins majority. It's a system that actually leads to a different kind of campaigning, as we've seen, I think, just in the last couple of months in the Democratic primary in New York City, where you had Zohran Mamdani and Brad Lander, even though they were competing against each other, realized, look, we have kind of a similar political background. We have kind of similar goals. Let's kind of get our voters together and rank us, close to each other. And that actually led to a kind of collaborative campaigning. It was very positive. It was not this kind of zero-sum understanding you see in most elections. So that's one benefit. See, the other thing about ranked choice voting that I think people don't know about is that if you combine it with proportional representation, you actually open the door to having third-party candidates and third-party representation in Congress. So proportional representation is, instead of voting for that one guy and having one representative per district, you actually have multiple representatives across a district. So a district might send 3, 4, 5, 6 people to Congress based on their population. And the district representatives are actually apportioned by the share each party wins of the vote. So if the Democratic Party wins 40%, 50% of the vote, they get 40, 50% of the seats. But also the other parties get a portion of the seats, depending on what proportion of the vote that they get. You combine this with ranked choice voting in ways that actually people say inevitably will lead to third-party representation in Congress. So there are a lot of different benefits I think you have to ranked choice voting in general, but the system we have currently, we just sort of take it for granted that you don't have to have a majority to win an election. You can just win on the basis of being the top guy, the first past the post, even if most people want you there. It's kind of democratically silly. And as you said, people who've experienced ranked choice voting, participated in ranked choice voting, it's much easier, much more intuitive than people, I think, assume. It's a different change. People need to be educated about, sure, but ultimately, we rank things all the time, just for fun, in our own lives. So the concept of saying, yeah, I'll look at all the candidates and I'll, make my evaluation of them relative to each other. It's not that crazy. It's not that different of a system.
It also, I think, it also creates a permission structure, I think, for more people to want to vote, right? When you don't feel like you are just making a complete value statement on your politics by choosing one candidate. I've often gone to the polls with severe disagreements with the person I ultimately choose because it is the best option available. How nice it would be to go with more than a couple of options and say this person more aligns with my values, but if they're not elected, this person would get my second vote.
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that this is something people face all the time. This idea that you're forced to vote for the lesser of the two evils, let's say in a given election, because you have that one vote and you'd better not waste it. Well, if you could rank your candidates, multiple candidates on the same ballot, you could make this kind of evaluation where, your first choice is your best ideal preference, and knowing that the person might not win or might not get, might not have a chance of winning, you still have your vote count for the other candidates that people are trying to badger you into voting for, but you can do the same thing on one ballot rather than having one vote that you are obligated to give to one of the two leading candidates in front of you.
You write so wonderfully about the filibuster. It's something we've talked about a lot, as you might imagine, on this show because of the way it's obstructed climate progress in the United States. I think it's very interesting. You write about the House of Representatives and just how the House should be way bigger than it is. There should be way more members than there are, and I think that that's fascinating. And I think it's interesting to talk about eliminating the filibuster. And it's way more fun and exciting to talk about eliminating the Senate. Why do we have a bicameral legislation, and how does this compare to other comparable nations?
Well, having a bicameral legislature isn't in and of itself all that unusual. A lot of our peer countries have it, obviously. What's unusual is the extent in the Senate of malapportionment, which is how distorted representation is on the basis of population. I think we have the most malapportioned upper chamber of peer nations, with the exception of Argentina and Brazil. We are that out of whack. So when I say, there's not a perfect democracy out there, and there's not a democracy that doesn't have its own problems, even understanding that, knowing that, the Senate is so population skewed that we are out of step with what you see internationally. And that has real implications, as I'm sure your listeners know, for policy. If the places that have an outsized say on energy policy, on climate policy, are places that are more rural, less populated. That shifts entirely what we're capable of doing when it comes to energy, climate regulation, transportation. And we see that in policy, year in, year out. The Senate was explicitly designed to be the chamber that represented property. They say this again explicitly at the convention. The Senate is going to be the place where the great men of America, the propertied men, have their own, domain, and can, to the extent that people might succeed in the House in passing or putting forward populist measures, well, the Senate's there to bat it down, to slow things down, and to say stop. And again, I think that's the function that the chamber has performed, I think, for most of our history, including up until today. Now, we did have a major climate bill obviously pass on the Biden administration, Inflation Reduction Act. But the way that came together should itself tell us something. So that happened through a process called budget reconciliation, which maybe your viewers know about, maybe they don't. But budget reconciliation is this: because ordinary legislation has to pass, functionally given the filibuster, with 60 votes. It's an impossible threshold for most things to me. People have, in the last couple of decades especially, found this workaround where you can actually pass legislation through the budget process with just a simple majority, provided it follows certain rules. It has to be related to spending and revenue in some fashion. It can't raise a deficit beyond a certain window. There are certain other requirements, right? But you can cobble together pieces of legislation that meet these rules and use that as a kind of end run or workaround, actually getting rid of the filibuster. And that's what happened with the IRA. And, it's an important climate bill. It does important things, but it's limited in the sense that, you cannot pass climate regulations through this process, right? You can't, do anything beyond outlaying money or cutting money through reconciliation. And so our ability to use our full set of policy tools to deal with climate change is still frustrated by the existence of the filibuster, and beyond the existence of the filibuster, again, the fundamental structure of the Senate, where the rural states, the more conservative states, less populated states, have an outsized say in the process. So what can we do about it? I mean, I think the first thing is get rid of the filibuster. Obviously, I don't know that any much more needs to be said about that. But it still leaves you with the Senate that's very, very skewed. And so the other thing I've discussed, and I think people have discussed a lot in the last decade, is adding new states, and adding states that seem more representative of the public as a whole, that at least would balance out the Senate and make it more representative. So DC, returning to that, you could grant statehood to the District of Columbia. That would grant DC's 2 senators, along with just like any other state. The territories could be admitted as states in the same way. All it takes is a simple majority. Once you eliminate the filibuster, this can be done if, most likely the Democratic Party decides that they want to do this. That would lead to an increase in, more urban, more populated states, left-leaning states, and that would sort of change the policy environment in that chamber and make it easier for us to pass all kinds of things, climate and beyond. That's, I think, the near to medium term solution for the Senate. Anything more ambitious than that, I think, is harder to imagine happening very, very soon. But I do think, and argue in the book, for working towards a new constitution, a new kind of constitutional order over time, as a movement, we can call it, similar to the feminist movement or the civil rights movement, a movement for democracy, to rework our institutions gradually. And I think that getting rid of the Senate is probably going to be a big, big part of what our goals should be there.
There's also been, especially in recent years, a lot of conversation of how to address the undemocratic structure of the Supreme Court and courts in general. What do you do? There's been a lot of conversations around packing the court. And as you write in the book, FDR tried it. It was controversial. It was also constitutional. And one of the things that I think is so interesting is you'll hear, okay, well, if one party packs the court and balances it toward a more liberal court or more conservative court, then the next party that gets in power is just going to do the same thing. And I think, well, great. Like, that's way more democratic if, first of all, who cares how many Supreme Court justices there are? It's an incredibly political entity, and having lived through Bush v. Gore, like it's like the cat's out of the bag. I don't know, So I just think if if one party starts packing the court and it better represents the voters, is that not a more democratic justice process?
Well, nothing is crazier than the system we have now. We are virtually, I mean, I don't know if there are any other countries that have the lifetime appointments for the Supreme Court justices. So, you know, somebody takes a fall who's on the Supreme Court, and you're all, watching CNN to figure out whether we have abortion rights anymore. That's an insane system. It's an insane system, and it creates all of these kind of perverse incentives so that every appointment to the court is this kind of zero sum game, and people try to maneuver their way onto it. It's not tenable, and no other country does things this way. And other countries, even though they have judicial review, the judiciary itself is much more of a civil service kind of neutral area. And so, packing the court, adding justices to the court, first of all, it's been done before. The court's size has changed multiple times in our history. It's constitutional, can be done by Congress. And I don't see any other alternative when it comes to taking climate change as seriously as we ought to, for instance. The idea that we could pass, if we magically had another great Democratic majority willing to, pass a big climate bill, and it went to the Supreme Court that was dominated by conservatives, and they started taking chunks out of it. If we take this problem seriously as a crisis, as I think we should, that's not an outcome we should be willing to accept. And so we don't really have an alternative but to create a court and create a judiciary that is going to be amenable to dealing with the situation with the urgency it demands. And that means adding justices. Conservatives, if they take Congress again, if they take the presidency again, could, yes, add justices of their own. But that's it's fine. What's the alternative of maintaining a conservative court until everybody who's on there dies or is replaced does not seem logical or sensible. And I think that the only way we get to a more neutral reform long term is to have this kind of tit for tat where people eventually get tired and say, okay, what can we do here? What can we come together and create a kind of neutral way of circulating justices through this body, or to create some form of partisan arrangement where there's a balance. I don't know, but the only way you get to that kind of a compromise, I think, is through having this kind of exchange over time of Democrats controlling the court, Republicans controlling the court, from election to election. But the status quo, I think we should all know and understand, is not tenable, and that's especially true if you take climate change as seriously as you ought to.
And I think about rewinding all the way back to 2016, which we basically had a version of this fight because they Republicans blocked the Merrick Garland nomination. So you basically had on the ballot the idea, like the idea of electing a Supreme Court justice was kind of on the ballot. So we've kind of done a dry run of this in the past.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know what it's going to take for people to understand that the court is a political body. It's not this kind of neutral set of folks who are just sort of sitting there in the clouds and making purely abstract judgments on the Constitution. It's a political body. It's functionally a legislature that's really weird already. And I think that we could make it more democratic in a way that serves our needs and moves us towards a more sensible and just body in the years ahead.
Here's a random question before I ask my last question. By chance, did you see the movie One Battle After Another this weekend?
I saw it literally last night.
It's fantastic. It kind of sets up the last question I want to ask here. Because I think one of the things, and we're not going to spoil the movie, one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is the idea, because I'm an elder millennial, and the idea of we have our time. And in our time, we are not going to accomplish everything, the world in which we may want to see, the ideal world. And as you talked about earlier in this conversation, a constant frustration with partisanship is kind of inherently in a democracy and is not entirely a bad thing, right? We're going to have real political fights. But thinking about this book, I'm thinking of what are some things we might be able to accomplish or see in our time? Having written this book, done all this reading, thinking about it, you mentioned a few things that we might be able to see, but like, what do you think are those first steps that we should take toward a better democracy or toward an actual democracy in America?
I think that the very, very first things I would like to see, assuming Democrats come to full control in Washington again in the near future, I think is just plausible, is kind of what we just finished talking about. I'd like to see the addition of new states. I'd like to see addition of justices to the Supreme Court. I'd like to see the completion of the non-national popular vote interstate compact. These are all things that I can imagine happening in the next 10 to 15 years with organization, with activism, with people understanding that these problems are important, which I don't think people necessarily have an understanding of. They know democracy isn't working. They don't really know why, partially because their leaders aren't telling them why. But if that changes, I think that we could see those things happen within the next 10 to 15 years, certainly. And those things alone, I think, transform American politics dramatically. But beyond that, when it comes to economic democracy, as we started discussing at the very beginning, the PRO Act, so making it easier to form traditional labor unions and also empowering them in new ways, preventing employers from constraining your ability to organize, doing away with right to work laws, that would change the labor organization infrastructure in America in dramatic ways. And I'd also like us to start real conversations about employee or worker ownership of major firms. And so one of the reforms I talk about is this idea by Bernie Sanders for inclusive ownership funds. Companies of a certain size gradually giving over about 20% of their shares to their workers. That would give them voting rights democratically. And also they'd pay out dividends, just like they'd pay out to ordinary shareholders on Wall Street. I don't know that I could see that happening in the next 10 to 15 years, but to begin that conversation and begin a real conversation about who really deserves the right to control the economy, who actually makes the economy run and what they're entitled to on that basis, who should be left in the position of making decisions about how these companies impact our planet, to have a real fundamental debates about that. Those are conversations we could start forcing to the table, I think, right now. And I think that would create a different kind of politics in this country. I think the people are really searching for, looking for vision right now, a sense of direction, and they're not getting it. The people who are really, teleological here are people on the right. They know what kind of country they want, and they're creating it every single day under this administration. We, on our other hands, don't have anything we're after beyond resisting that. But I think we can do more. I think we can say, look, democracy is not just this thing that we did, that we're now going over with a feather duster and trying to protect from these other threats. It's nothing we've ever accomplished. But we ourselves consider ourselves on the path to creating democracy for the first time and to creating a society where we really, truly do govern ourselves in all kinds of ways, not just politically, but economically in our own lives. And this is the means by which we're going to save the planet itself. That's a compelling and galvanizing vision. And so what I think we accomplish is those concrete things at the federal level. I think, too, that there's room for experimentation and democratization at the state and local level as well. I talk about that a little bit in the book, and I might explore it in my writing moving forward. But I hope overall, beyond that, we begin a real conversation about democracy that's not just defensive. It's not just about protecting, saving, whatever. It's about creating, because it's exciting to create. And we can all have a hand in that act of creation, that creating a society, country we really want. That alone, if nothing else is accomplished in the next 10 to 15 years, that alone, I think, sets on a trajectory towards a better country, and I hope a better planet.
So well put. Again, the book is The Right of the People, and I'm so glad that you read what you've called dry books and were able to create this very compelling and very straightforward look at the history of the lack of democracy in America, what's possible, what can be done. I felt like this was a very accessible book, and for someone like myself that I've read your writing for years now. You're just consistently one of the best political thinkers writing in the United States. So what a pleasure it is to read the book. I'm so glad you wrote the book, and thank you so much for coming on the show to talk about it at length. We just scratched the surface here, and I think our listeners are going to love picking up this book. So thank you so much for writing it.
Thank you so much for saying so, and thank you for having me.